Let me apologize up front. I seem to be losing my voice. I've been struggling with some post-nasal stuff, and it's causing that. So if my voice gives out, sermon will be over early, I guess. Many of you may not know this about me, but before I decided that the Lord was calling me towards the ministry path, I thought that God was calling me towards the psychology path. And so I was in school. I have a master's degree in clinical psychology, and that's what I was going to do. And I was in clinical psychology planning that I would have a practice where I would sit and talk to people. Man, I did not know how stupid that was going to be, right? But I was going to plan this, but I had such a voracious appetite when I was in my psych training program for something that they call neurophysiology. And so my clinical degree is a master's degree in clinical psychology with an emphasis in neurophysiology, because all I was doing was taking these courses upon how the brain works. How does the brain work? I'm fascinated by how the brain works, about how neural pathways get formed in our brains, and how if a child, one of the emphasis that I had because of my own background was that if a child is raised in stress, do you know that their neural pathways are formed a completely different way than the child who is raised in a home that is loving and calm? Did you know that? So I can tell you honestly that the reason why I am a reactionary is because I was raised in a home full of stress, and my neural pathways have been formed differently than a child who has been raised in a home where there was no stress when they were growing up. Our brains are such fascinating things. Our minds are so fascinating in our lives. The latest research on some of your brain activity is that our minds are oriented toward the negative. Did you know that? Our minds are like Velcro, and they're oriented toward what is negative out in the world. So if you find something going on that's negative in the world, like the Velcro that your brain is, that's another piece of matching Velcro, and it will stick. And you will ruminate on it, and you will hold it, and you will keep it there for a long time. But our minds are not oriented toward the positive. Positive against the Velcro of our brain is like satin. If you put satin up against a piece of Velcro, it won't stick because it's got gloss over it. It's got a property about it that causes it to be like gossamer, and so it won't stick. So if you want it to stick to that Velcro, you know what you have to do? If something positive comes up on your life, you have to stop what you're doing, and you have to ruminate on that for at least 15 seconds. Or that positive thing will flit in and flit out. It'll flit in and flit out because it can't stick unless you purposely stop yourself and focus upon the positive for 15 seconds or more. And the other thing that's coming up in brain research is this, is if you are a person who does not exercise that neural pathway toward positivity, if you don't use your brain towards positivity, those neural pathways in your brain die. The brain is an organ that has to be worked. It has to be in motion. It has to be being used all the time for the neural pathways to keep going. So if you find something that's positive and you don't focus upon it, you're actually stopping the growth of the positive neural pathways in your brain. They will just completely shut down. And when the positive neural pathways in your brain shut down, do you know what grows? The negative neural pathways in your brain. So knowing all of that, imagine my shock as I was driving down the road the other day listening to Richard Rohr on a audiobook, and he's talking about Paul when he says, all sin comes from the mind. And then he started talking about how sin comes from the mind because our negative neural pathways are so entrenched in our brains. Our negative neural pathways are what tell us that we're not satisfied. Our negative neural pathways are what teach us that we want more and more and more and more because we don't focus upon the things that are actually satisfying us. That was one of those moments where I almost ran off the road because I was like, I can't write this down and I have to try and remember this for a sermon. Because that makes sense. Deep down in here to me. That makes sense. That which we do, remember we've been talking about the things that we do in this lower self that we have, the things that we do in the lower self that are all about us, all about us, all about us, come from those places in our minds where we feel dissatisfaction, where we feel like we never have enough, or where we feel like we aren't enough. I can be honest with you and tell you, I will confess to you, that the majority of my dissatisfaction in the world comes from that place deep down inside of me where those neural pathways were oriented towards negativity that say, you, Jana, are not enough. The majority of my dissatisfaction, those times when I'm feeling the worst in my world, I can map those all the way back to a feeling deep down inside of me that says, I am not enough. I am not enough. And when we feel deep down inside of ourselves that we are not enough in this world, then we begin acting like we don't have enough, we will never get enough, we will never be enough in this world. And when we're locked up in all of this we are not enoughness and we don't have enoughness, all of a sudden our actions become about filling those negative needs that we have. It comes about saying, I don't have enough, so guess what, I'll cheat on my taxes just this first time, so I'll get $10,000 back in my tax return this time. I don't have enough, so it won't matter if I go to Kohl's and I've bought 5 shirts and they actually missed one of the tags and they only rang up 4. You see all of those things? They all talk to that false lower self that the Apostle Paul is trying in all of his writings to get us to recognize about ourselves. The Apostle Paul, I have come to understand, writes about the fact that we have a struggle, a deep, deep struggle with understanding that which the kingdom is. Because we're locked in all of the negativity because it sticks in our brains so much faster. Think about this book called Philippians. Think about that. Remember last week I said that Paul had been in jail in Philippi before. Well, when Paul is writing to the Philippians, he's also in jail. The scholars believe that he was in jail in another part of the world as he's writing this letter to Philippi where he had been in jail before. And he's sitting in a jail cell and he's writing to them to think upon the things that are lovely, to think upon the things that are true, to think upon the things that are hopeful. All of that stuff that he writes about thinking about those things that will bring you joy or that bring joy in this world. And then he says, rejoice in the Lord always. He's sitting in a place where he is isolated. He's away from his followers. He's away from being with people. And he's still writing out, don't go to the negative portion. Go to that higher portion. Go to the higher recognition of things in the world. I don't know if I could sit in prison and write you all a letter that says, be happy. Don't worry, be happy. I don't know if I could sit in a prison somewhere and say to you all, rejoice in the Lord always, because my neural pathways in my brain would be saying, this is wrong, this is not fair, I've been unfairly jailed. I would go that direction. I would go there. I remember when I was a teenager in high school, in my freshman year of high school, I had an English teacher, his name was Mr. Renwick. Everybody loved Mr. Renwick. Everybody loved Mr. Renwick. He was this tall guy with blonde hair. He was, the baseball coach. Everybody loved Mr. Renwick. One time he came back to my desk and he says, if you can't stop being cynical while I'm talking, could you leave? I was 14 years old. And there's Mr. Renwick, 6.5 foot tall, standing in front of my desk saying, if you can't stop being cynical, would you please leave my class? I was cynical. before I was 14 years of age. And what I was cynical about in that particular situation was there was a group of us in school who wanted to do something, and the administration wouldn't let us do it. And so Mr. Renwick was talking about that in class, about the proper ways to hold a debate, the proper ways to hold your position. And I'm going, you need to stop, because you can't fight the system. I was 14 years old, and I was already convinced that you couldn't fight the system. I've carried that with me for a long, long time. That thought process, that negativity, that going to the worst possible case scenario. Because in my mind, what I have always thought is that joy and peace and love is for other people, not me, because I can't fight the system. The Apostle Paul says, if you can't fight the system, who can? If you can't do it, if you can't be the one who stands up for peace, who stands up for joy, who stands up for the Lord and rejoices even in the midst of trouble, who in the world is possibly going to be able to do that? You see, the Apostle Paul is talking about how we need to let go of those things which are dark and look toward the light. We need to understand that the problems that are created in the world are all because of us. He's not talking to us about, oh, you're a bad person, so God's going to give you that. He's talking about the fact that because we can never, ever get to a place of being satisfied with what we have, we end up creating the wars and the injustice and all of the problems that we have in this world. And the simple yet very, very, very complex and difficult answer to that is to become people who are the light in the world. To become people who fix their thoughts upon the light. To become people whose minds are built toward that which is lovely, that which is true, that which is hope-filled, that which is peace-filled, that which is love. My brothers and sisters, I'm here to tell you, you cannot do that if you don't think you are enough. You can't do that if you don't think you are enough. If you don't think that you can fight the system, you cannot get those neural pathways in your brain activated to be on love versus being on despair. Our world suffers from the disease of not enoughness. Think about it. Your friend gets a brand new car. You're out there, oh, that's great, that's wonderful. But in the back of your head, you're going, yeah, jerk, you got a new car. You're driving a Cadillac and I'm driving my Vega from 1979. We are built with this envy deep down inside of us that comes from this idea that what other people have, we have to have. What other people get, we have to get. You know, if somebody's telling you, well, I had a chef come to my house and fix my dinner for the night, and you're thinking, yeah, I had SpaghettiOs. Instead of being authentically happy that the person was able to do that, our negative neural pathways tend to take us to the place of, well, it must be nice that they can do that. It must be nice that they can go see that show. It must be nice that they can take that vacation. And I think if he was here with us today, the Apostle Paul would tell us to stop it. Stop it. Because each of us can only know that we're enough when we don't need all of that crap. I'm going to say that again. Each of us can only know that we are enough when we don't need all of the crap. When we can walk through the world and say, it doesn't matter whether I have the best car, the best home, the best friends, because I am enough for God just the way that I am. Let me remind you how bad Paul was. Let me remind you that the Apostle Paul was Joe #1 murderer in his day. Killing people because they believed in the light. Killing people because they were thinking about the higher level things. Killing people because they were letting go of their need to have it for themselves. If the Apostle Paul can change, if the Apostle Paul could be so transformed, well, he wasn't even the apostle then. He was just known as Saul, who became Paul, who the disciples didn't like because they thought he was horning in on their business. If that man can let go of needing to have that kind of power, the carte blanche power of murder, don't you think that we can change? Don't you think that we can get ourselves in our minds to the place where we go to the positive, where we go to the light, where we go to being the light in the world? Now, I have to tell you, I struggle every single solitary day with being negative because my brain is wired that way. I used to be the kind of person that if somebody walked up to me and said, "Oh, you look really nice today," the first thought in my head was, "Didn't I look nice yesterday?" I ain't lying to you. You know, I'm standing right here. If I'm lying, strike me, right? I'm not lying to you. I used to be the kind of person who, when I would get an A on my paper in seminary, okay, come on, we're not talking about elementary school here. When I would get an A on my paper in seminary, the first thing I would think was, well, why wasn't it an A+? I used to be the kind of person when somebody would say to me, "You're so nice and loving and compassionate," I would think to myself, "Yeah, you really don't know me." Because I could not accept that it didn't matter what I had. It didn't matter what I did. In the eyes of God, I was enough. I could not accept that. And there are days in my life that I still don't accept that very well. But then I always have Kathleen Bolger saying, "Stop that." She's my Apostle Paul, by the way. Stop that! Stop that! Part of our job as Christian people is to not allow our minds to rule us. We, as Christian people, allow God to rule us. We allow God to orient our steps. We allow God to help us get to the place. We walk in the light of the Lord. It means we don't have the power. It means that we have to let go of all of that. And let me tell you, it's a really letting go kind of situation when you finally accept that God will love you and cherish you and hold you and comfort you, even if you are what other people perceive to be the worst person on the face of the earth. God loves us even when we're struggling. God loves us more when we're struggling, I think. And so it becomes then a choice for us. Are we people of the light, or are we people of those dark, negative things? Are we people who see the world, our brothers and sisters, as enough? Or are we people who see our brothers and sisters out in the world as people to conquer, people to have power over? That's our choice. And it's a choice that our world needs us to understand and make. Amen. Come now to the time in our worship service when we have the chance